So I want to talk about what the law can do and what society can do. And society, there is such a thing as society, it's you and me. This is what I'm going to cover, just a little bit about myself. I'm not going to say very much since June has already described me. And I want to talk about something I've called bad attitudes and bad behaviors. And bad is a very elastic word. It covers a lot of things. Then I want to talk about what the law can do and then what we can do. And while I was preparing this talk, I really focused for the first time on the fact that I think there is what I would call an old anti-Muslim attitude and there's a new anti-Muslim attitude. Both of them involve not liking Muslims, but I think they have different origins. So not going to say much about myself. As well as being co-chair of the Muslim Jewish Forum, I'm also the chairman of the Islam and Liberty Network, which is a think tank based in Kuala Lumpur, which emphasizes that Islam is fully compatible with religious, political, and economic freedom. The thing I want to stress is that both my presentation tonight and everything I say on my website are my own, and they're not the views of either the Muslim Jewish Forum or the Islam and Liberty Network. My colleagues on the forum may agree with me, they may disagree with me, that's their privilege, but I always say what I think. So first of all, let's look at attitudes and behaviors, bad ones. And there is a range. At one end, you've got somebody who just refuses to socialize with Muslims. That's not good, it's bad. At the far end, it seems peculiar to describe genocide as bad. It's not just bad, it's appalling, it's terrible, but that's about the worst thing I can think of doing. And Muslims have suffered genocide, for example, in Srebrenica. And I've got a couple of other ones in between. And those behaviors, of course, come from attitudes. And the problem with attitudes is that we cannot read people's minds. We have to go by what they do and what they say. But never forget that minds can be changed. And that's something I come back to towards the end of the presentation. Now, people's bad deeds, they fall into two categories. There are things, bad deeds, where the law can get involved, and there are others where the law can't get involved. You're down to only making things socially unacceptable, persuading people, etc. So let's start off by looking at what the law can do, and indeed in the United Kingdom, what the law does. One of my bad behaviors earlier on was I refused to employ a Muslim. I won't employ Muslims. At one time in this country, that was legal. Just as at one time in this country, it was perfectly legal to say, I won't employ black people. The Equality Act 2010 is the latest version of our equalities law, and that sets out 10 protected characteristics, one of which is religion or belief. And then it goes on to make many bad behaviors criminal offenses. It's unlawful to discriminate in employment. It's unlawful to refuse to sell your house to somebody who has a religion that you dislike. If you're providing services to the public, for example, if you run a restaurant, it's unlawful to say you won't serve a Muslim if he walks in and wants to order a meal. The other category of bad behavior, I talked about inciting hatred against Muslims. Inciting hatred against people of a different race was criminalized in 1986, but in the Public Order Act. And from that time onwards, separate question mark about whether you could be done under some other kind of law, perhaps if you were inciting hatred of black people in, say, 1970. But since 1986, it's been crystal clear that a variety of incitement behaviors are unlawful. And since then, people of a race, like me, people who, it doesn't matter whether you want to describe me as Punjabi or Pakistani or Asian, I have a racial category, and I've been protected by the Public Order Act. And the Public Order Act in particular protects Jews and Sikhs against racial hatred, because the law has held in court decisions that Jews and Sikhs are racial groups. However, Muslims are not a racial group, and it was recognized that inciting hatred against Muslims was not covered by that incitement offense created in 1986. Eventually, the Tony Blair government legislated in 2006 to make religious hatred also an offence. It was in this act in 2006, but it did it by amending the 1986 Public Order Act by putting in a new Part 3A. And when this legislation was going through Parliament, something that was of great concern to very many people was that making it a criminal offence to incite religious hatred should not be used as an indirect way of protecting religions from being criticised, preserving people's freedom to speak about religion, etc. And therefore, there is a very important provision, Section 29J of the Public Order Act 1986, as it now stands, which I've copied here on this slide. I'm not going to read it out. I've added a bit of red to make it easier to home in on some of the key provisions. And it's fine to ridicule a religion, to say that you don't like it. It's fine to say that people who practice that religion should stop practicing it. All of those are protected from being an incitement of religious hatred. If I can give you an example, a few years ago now, about maybe 3 or 4 years, a Northern Ireland minister, I think from memory his name was Pastor McConnell, said something like, Islam is the devil's religion. And he was prosecuted by the police, in my view quite wrongly, because I could see that would be a hopeless prosecution, and indeed the courts acquitted him, because he was clearly protected by this carve-out to protect religious freedom. If he'd said that Muslims should be killed, that clearly would have been a criminal offense, or Muslims should be expelled from this country. But saying that Islam is a terrible religion, everybody should give it up. If you want to say that the Quran is a fake book copied from the Bible, nobody should pay any attention to it, that's your privilege. And at times we need to be very precise in the distinctions. As I've said, attacking Muslims, inciting hatred against Muslims is a crime. Attacking Islam is not a crime. Being rude about the Quran, being rude about the religion of Islam, being rude about the Prophet Muhammad may be socially unacceptable. It depends on the social circles you move in. There are some social circles, sadly, where that might not be unacceptable. But the law does not want to intervene in that situation. The law wants to protect people, not protect an abstract thing, namely a religion. And one of the questions I asked myself while I was preparing was, do we need any new laws? And my view in the United Kingdom is that we don't. We have a very strong law against discrimination in the Equality Act. It does need better enforcement. Quite regularly, people do tests. They send off CVs to potential employers, the researchers do, and the CVs are basically identical in terms of people's experience and qualifications, but some of the applicants have names like John Smith, and some of the applicants have names like Mohammed Amin. And John Smith is much more likely to be called for an interview than Mohammed Amin. And that is clearly wrong. We need mechanisms to challenge that. Maybe we need to prosecute more people, but the law itself is there. There's nothing wrong with the law. And similarly, incitement of hatred against Muslims is a criminal offense. And while Muslims may not like people slagging off Islam, Christians have to put up with it all the time. Christianity has been slagged off in this country for decades. Sometimes people disguise their hatred of Muslims in language that looks like they're only talking about Islam. And that can be very hard to spot and identify and distinguish. All I can say is you need to look at the facts. It's a bit like the issue in anti-Semitism, where people sometimes say they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just criticizing and attacking Israel, but they do it in such a way and so obsessively that it's obvious that person just hates Jews. And you do find the same thing with people hiding their hatred of Muslims in language that says we're actually criticizing Islam. Social things you just cannot govern by law. If somebody won't make friends with Muslims, if somebody won't vote for Afzal Khan, for example, because he's a Muslim politician, if somebody just won't socialize with Muslims, the law can't get involved. It's the job of Muslims and non-Muslims who are sensible to help change those attitudes by talking to people. So now I want to go on to the question of how we actually change people's attitudes. And here I'm particularly addressing Muslims, but it applies equally to non-Muslims who want to help to make our society better. And as I said, I identify that there are old anti-Muslim attitudes and new ones. History of Europe, 2,000 years in one slide, basically. We had a totally hegemonic Christian church. In Western Europe, it was the Roman Catholic Church. In Eastern Europe, Russia, it was the Orthodox Church. And after Martin Luther, we also had the Protestant churches. And in Europe, there was enormous hostility to the Jews that lived in Europe amongst these Christians and to Judaism as a religion. Historically, Christianity as a new religion defined itself against Judaism. At the same time, these Europeans were very conscious of facing an external threat from Muslims and Islam. Remember, starting in the mid-600s, Arabs had conquered the whole of North Africa, which was all Christian until the Arabs conquered it. They even conquered Spain, although the Spaniards eventually reconquered it, and they conquered eastwards to places like Iran. But as far as the Europeans were concerned, they were particularly worried about the Arab conquest. And later on, when the Ottoman Turks came along, captured Byzantium, Constantinople, as it was then called, and then spread into Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, and were besieging Vienna. And I picked the date 1683, which was the last time the Ottoman Turks tried to capture Vienna. And that date, Anders Behring Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist who killed a lot of young people because he felt that the Norwegian government wasn't anti-Muslim enough, he was obsessed with the assault on Vienna. So what can we do about this? We need to know history better and then to share that more accurate history. Muslims have made a massive contribution to world civilization. There was actually a very long history of Arabs and Christians collaborating. Lots of Christians carried on living and still do today, living in countries that were conquered by the Arabs. There's a very big Christian minority in Egypt, for example. In the Lebanon, there was a very big Christian minority in Iraq until the 2003 invasion. Something even more interesting, which I only learned a few years ago, when the Ottomans were besieging Vienna, there were Christians fighting on both sides. Obviously, there were Christians defending Vienna, but there were other Christians fighting with the Ottoman Turks. And there were also Muslims fighting on the side of the Viennese, because there's been a long-standing Muslim community in Lithuania, and they were actually allied with the Viennese. History isn't as simple us Europeans against them Muslims. It's much more complicated than that. The language that we use can either divide or unite. If a Muslim keeps talking about how he worships Allah, while a Christian is talking about how they worship God, it's very easy to assume that you're talking about two different gods. I have come across otherwise educated Americans who really think that. Obviously, if you ask the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope, they will tell you that Muslims worship exactly the same God as Christians. And when I talk about Islam, I only ever talk about God. Similarly, when Muslims talk about Isa, it's very easy to confuse people. Talk about Jesus. A very easy trap to fall into is this phrase Muslim world, which I see regularly, and I hate it because it implies that there's something different about the Muslim part of the world that is somehow fundamentally different from what people call the West, which is another phrase I actually personally avoid. I only ever talk about Muslim majority countries, because as soon as you say Muslim majority countries, and there's no country where 100% of the people living there are Muslims, then straight away you're aware that the countries where those countries have minorities, and similarly, Britain is simply a country where Muslims are in a minority. The word we should never be used to talk about British Muslims, because straight away it separates British Muslims from the rest of Britons. I talk about British Muslims, I say British Muslims. When I use the word we, I'm referring to everybody in the UK. Get involved, talk to schools, write, get involved on issues that are nothing to do with Islam. If you're in the NHS, get involved in issues to do with NHS leadership. Because, for example, when I speak about tax policy, I'm also sending out another message, which is that Muslims are normal British people and often highly educated and very expert British people. And finally, I want to talk about what I call the new anti-Muslim attitudes. And fundamentally, the cause of these new anti-Muslim attitudes is Muslims behaving badly. I've lived in this country since 1952, and the white Britons from that time until 1989 only saw me as an Asian. They were not in the least bit interested in my religion. I was an Asian until 1989, and then I was thought of as a Muslim. 1989 is the time of the Salman Rushdie affair. We then see terrorism, we see riots, small riots in this country, big riots overseas about the Danish cartoons. Even more recently, we see ISIS taking Yazidi women as sex slaves, killings at Charlie Hebdo. One that particularly annoys me because it affects the country of my birth, we see Mumtaz Qadri, the killer of the governor of the Punjab, Salman Taseer, over Pakistan's blasphemy laws, celebrate. He was hanged by the Pakistani government, Mumtaz Qadri, but we see him celebrated in Pakistan by hundreds of thousands of people as a hero, and we see him celebrated by significant groups of Muslims in this country. I'm not claiming they're a majority, but quite a lot of Muslims in this country have also celebrated him as a hero. And the reaction of non-Muslims, let's be frank about it, they see Muslims acting like savages. They see Muslims as a threat on what they regard as our freedoms. They're actually my freedoms as well. And they think of Muslims as a danger to everybody. And this is what is whipping up anti-Muslim hatred today. And how can Muslims respond to this? The first point is to be when you criticize Muslims who do things that are wrong, you have to do it unequivocally. And historically, Muslims have been reluctant to criticize other Muslims. And any hedging, equivocation, or even explanation is taken by the people listening to you as sympathy for the bad guys. Another one which particularly annoys me is that a lot of Muslims have trouble accepting openly that people like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the 7/7 bombers, other terrorists are motivated by their understanding of Islam. And when you deny that, it's taken as if you're trying to hide some kind of awful secret about Islam, that Islam is a religion that encourages terrorism. That's not true. But when you're not prepared to talk about the issue, about why these terrorists think what they think, it comes over as evasive. And where there's a clash, as you see it, between traditional Islamic teachings as you see them and European liberalism, be prepared to debate that, because people want to ask questions about it. Where you stand on that line, I mean, there are ultra-Orthodox Jews who are incredibly restrictive versus what you might call European liberalism, but everybody who has these traditional views can't avoid the challenge of debating them and being asked questions about them. And whether you like it or not, every Muslim in this country is an ambassador for Islam. You're expected to be talked about it. You're taken as representative of Islam. So you have to live up to that. And that's all I want to say.